Welcome to B2B Sales Trends, the podcast dedicated to sales leaders in the B2B space, where we share conversations about innovative and successful sales transformations to keep you up to date on the latest trends. This podcast is brought to you by Global Performance Group.
Welcome to the latest episode of the B2B Sales Trends podcast, my lovely people. The show that brings you hacks, tips, thought leadership to the topic of B2B selling. My name is Harry Kendlbacher, and today's episode, I'm super pleased to have a fabulous expert in Brian North with us. Brian, welcome to the B2B Sales Trends podcast.
Thank you, Harry. Thanks for having me. And I wanted to say something before we get started. This morning, I listened to your podcast about 5 steps to increase win rates. And anybody who's listening to this should go listen to that podcast because your notation on key agreements is a vital and often overlooked point. And I thought that was wonderful. So I just wanted to mention that this morning.
Oh, Brian, your star. I appreciate, first of all, you listening to it. And second of all, you liking it and positioning this. Thank you. This is the next 20-25 minutes is really about your expertise. And Brian, you are the VP of Strategic Partnership at Hearst. Maybe as a form of introduction, give us a bit of an overview about yourself, about Hearst, your current role. That will be fabulous.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, once again, thanks for having me. So I've been at Hearst now for a little under a year, but my career spans about 25 years. Here at Hearst, my primary focus is on, performance and innovation within the media sales world. My goals are to try to align our local sales teams and our regional sales teams and even some national activations under sort of a unified strategic narrative. And that often is comprised of translating data and content and audience insights into value-based selling and then helping that to drive revenue, of course. And so, my short term, I think I'm on maybe month 7 or 8 now here. The focus has really been for me to create sort of a consistent execution across what's somewhat of a decentralized sales force across an ever-changing media landscape, right? And so, just a little background on me. I got started off in integrated marketing on the agency side about 25 years ago. Moved in working in the print world as well as the broadcast world for over 20 years. Spent a good amount of time over the last 10 managing teams of roughly 10 to 15 sellers on local, regional, and national media activations, pretty much across all forms of media, including a lean in on digital as well. And so, what I focus on in my sort of current level is making solution-based selling a priority. I think we've if you know anything about the media world, especially the traditional media world and print and broadcast, it was a very transactional type of sell. There were those days when you would, go play golf and close a deal on a martini lunch, of course. But for the better half of the last 30 years, those industries became fairly transactional. And now, given the ecosystem and what's happened, companies have reinvented and learned, a consultative approach, and I've sort of seen that full arc of the industry transformation over the past 20 years, and it's been pretty wild because it's, as you know, media is incredibly fragmented and it's a very fast-moving landscape, and it's not just the sellers that can't keep up. Sometimes it's the buyers. So that's the world that we live in now.
Yeah. You mentioned something interesting that you're very focused on strategy and its execution, and we always hear that there is a disconnect between the two. The strategy, the actual execution, how it's executed, and especially the results that come out of it. In your industry, or outside of your industry, because I don't think it's industry specific. what do you see as the biggest challenges when it really comes to turning that sales strategy into actual, what sticks for frontline sellers, and what's sort of the disconnect between the strategy and the execution?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And what I've observed is the breakdown often happens in translation. And strategy is typically built in conference rooms, right? And but the sellers are live in the client meetings where the context is constantly shifting, right? And
Mm.
so, I think that something that might sound great on a slide in a conference room or something can fall flat when it's not really actionable or tailored to the frontline realities. And those frontline realities are moving at the speed of sound. And I think you're right, Harry. I don't think it just applies to working within media. I think you see that in tech and healthcare and finance and all types of sales. And so the biggest challenge right now is that distilling sort of those complex strategies into repeatable seller friendly narratives, right, that align with how clients are actually buying. And so, if there were discussions happening between, do we have a misalignment between, sort of HQ and corporate versus the field, right? And are we looking at those daily conversations? Are we taking input from the front lines to make sure that that's informing our strategy? Whether our strategy, in my division, I always feel like strategy is sort of an overused. It can be like an overused term. It's like, what does strategy actually mean? And for me, it's always a path forward, and it's always a path to achieve something and get to something. And what we live in a world now. We live in a very acronym jargon happy world, right? And so I think sometimes, if you look at some of these like corporate strategic decks that come down, and it's just like they're too high level. They're not abstract. Sellers need to be able to apply some of these quickly. So there's an overcomplication that I think falls in a lot of the informing of how we need to go to market and what we need to focus on and what verticals we need to pull from and those things. And so, there in the sort of two other things I think that the industry sees along strategy and execution breakdown is there's pretty inconsistent reinforcement, right? I think even the strongest strategies can die in the field because they didn't have proper enablement, the tools or resources weren't there to execute. And I'm going to take ownership of that too. Sometimes the failure falls on management coaching, and there wasn't really good, clear management coaching on helping these sellers move to where we're trying to get them to move to, whether it be with a buyer or a vertical or a product or what have you. And so, the measurement along all of those lines has to be really, really clear. And I feel like sometimes, especially in media, we measure activity and not impact. And we're more focused on call volume and appointment sets and proposals out and things like that. And so for me, there's a measurement disconnect because really we're moving in the right direction if the impact is we tapped into a vertical we didn't have before, right? Or we have a better seller incentive in place, and now we're seeing growth on a specific product that we didn't have before. And so, I always try to bring it back to activity is important, yes, but also understand where the impact also plays in on that.
Yeah, and I agree with you on a lot of the things that you've shared. I think one of the simplest disconnects between strategy and execution that I always see with other organizations is that, yes, leadership comes up with that deck, as you referred to, and they think they have it all figured out. They trickle it down to one level down, maybe, but then it gets diluted from there to the actual people who need to execute it where it matters most, at the point of customer interface. And that's where the challenge then really is. And sometimes as simple as, have we really communicate what our path is, as you had described it, effectively to the people who need to execute. Sometimes as simple as that,
Yeah.
there is a disconnect. It's fascinating. You know, obviously it takes then for the sellers a certain mindset and a skill set. You are in an industry which is fast moving, constantly changing. In such fast changing industry, and I'll say industries because many are fast changing these days. What in your opinion sort of shifts in terms of mindset and skill sets do you think sellers need nowadays to execute effectively on some of the strategic goals that hopefully have been communicated? So
Yeah.
what sort of a mindset and skill set do you think that sellers need today to execute effectively?
Yeah, that is a really good question, and I listened to a few of the podcasts that you've produced recently, and if
Oh, thank you.
you kind of look at what the thread and what sort of commonality in the thread and a lot of what the folks are saying, and it's so true, and that's that there's that shift from being a product pusher to a business problem
Um,
solver, right? And so I think that I'll give you something that just happened yesterday. I had my team pair up and give me a 10-minute problem strategy. What are we solving for solution on an account? And they had to do it within 10 minutes, because I feel like if we can't identify the problem and say here's the solution to that problem, or here's the business outcome we're looking for, then we got to acquire a little bit more knowledge, right, on what we're doing. And so there's that shift, and it's so easy, especially in my industry where we are product heavy, right? I mean, because we're out here selling social ads and print ads and television ads and magazine ads and everything that you see on your mobile device. And so there's just a lot everywhere for everybody to be at all times, and it can be really uh, overwhelming, I think, for the sellers and the buyers. And so they just go to sort of their comfort products that they know how to sort of talk eloquently about, and they know that there's some good metrics on. But sometimes those comfort products are not going to solve the business problem
Sure.
that they're trying to solve for. And so,
One.
I think that and so you asked about mindset and skills and the shift. So, I think that it requires more than just knowledge. I think that people have to have curiosity. I think that you have to be really adaptable. I think that you need to be able to synthesize data into insights. All of that is really important. You got to move your mindset from selling inventory to solving problems, period. And you also have to be really, really comfortable with ambiguity. And what I mean
Mm,
by that is being okay with fluid processes and evolving product sets. I mean,
yeah.
look at where the stock market was, 3 months ago, or look where, everybody who was preaching anything around finance was calling out recessions and saying that, there's a lot of fear out there and consumer confidence was going down. And all of that has implications on advertising, has implications on our clients' bottom lines, has implications on what strategies they're going to invoke in their media plans. And so you as a consultant have to be able to be okay with that ambiguity and not being able to look down the path. You can have a vision, you can see the tunnel, you can see the air, but know that potentially that tunnel does wind, and you have to go with it, accordingly. And if you're not curious and you don't want to learn more about what a buyer is saying to you or how they see the market shifts, you're going to be really, really struggling. And there was a really good advertising consultant who lived and has passed, but he wrote some great books back in the 70s and 80s that I still read today. And one of the things that he says constantly is the lean in on storytelling, right? And I think sometimes we become so fact based, and we're talking analytics, and we don't really put that into an actionable narrative. And I tend to sometimes tell my team that if you don't have a story to share, uh, then no one's going to buy into what you're talking about. so so
It is so true that I'm reading this book at the moment, the CEO Whisper, I think it's called, and it talks about how, there's so much stuff out there on storytelling, and this is how you have to storytell, and this is how. But the reality is, it's only a good story if it's dead simple. If you can really explain it in simple terms to a kid in a way that and that child understands it. So keep it as simple as possible, because otherwise you lose people and they will not follow you. I want to get back to this. I like your term, what you said about comfort products. I actually haven't heard that term yet, so thank you for sharing. I'm going to nick that off of you. It's the idea of, okay, we really have to get into a problem-solving mindset, and in our terms, we always refer to it as outcomes. So if we can provide outcomes to our clients, what's the point in having a conversation, right? Why? Because the relationship won't last. There's a certain curiosity that's necessary for open problem solving and really digging deep into things. Why do you think that people are uncomfortable doing that?
Well, we talk a lot in sales leadership about skill and will, right? We talk a lot about the competence aligning with confidence, and if you don't
Right.
have both of those in measure balanced, sometimes that can come across to your
Right.
approach. And I think that it's human nature, right, to um, go to where you most feel secure
Mm.
on things, right? And so, and I think that's by the way, I would challenge anybody who works within the spectrum of sales in any vertical in the globe to ask them, do you think you're at optimal skill and will level? I think that is a always teeter totter back and forth thing that we manage, right? But it's being cognizant of it and aware of it is really the 90% of that battle.
Yeah. And I really like what you said. And we actually have this as one of our marketing lines for our organization. So, what it takes really to effectively problem solve is you got to have courage, right?
Yeah.
You got to have courage to get out of your comfort zone. But what gives you that courage is what you've shared, the competence of the skills and the confidence that you are doing it well, you've practiced it, and you can execute it. The competence and the confidence together will give you the courage to do that.
Yeah.
It's a nice dynamic.
Harry, when the best time to call on, if you're in the developmental world, when the best time to call on a new prospect is
Go ahead.
10 minutes after you have closed a deal, because your confidence is so
That's
high.
right. That's right. That's right. This confidence is sky high. You think you have the confidence because you just closed it. So go for another one. You're probably busy celebrating at that stage. So
Right.
that's why people don't do it.
Right.
Love it. And you mentioned something that earlier, a couple of questions ago, and I noted it down, is the fact that buying has changed. What have you seen, in your industry or in your world? How has buying behavior changed, and how has that impacted, win rates, for example?
Yeah. So I think that buyers are incredibly overwhelmed. Well, it's funny. Let me preface this. I think they're overwhelmed with options and underwhelmed with results. Right. And so they're I think that they can be skeptical. They're skeptics by nature, because if you're not really tuned in on the business outcome and the client strategy, and you don't know a lay of that land, and you haven't really mapped it out, and in my opinion, you're wasting the buyer's time. And so I can understand, and there's a lot of individuals that just don't take the time and effort that's needed in order to qualify that prospect and move them where they want to move them. And so I think that long answer to your short question, the buying mindset has become more skeptical, I think, than where it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And that's just because I don't want to say bad actors, but there's just a lot of people who are not willing to do the work that is really required as well. With that being said, um, I think that buyers are, especially in the agency side of things, they're being held accountable to to measurement and performance and attribution and budget efficiencies more than they ever have been. And so brands are doing that, and brands have their in-house teams that are doing that as well. But if you monitor what's happening within the advertising agency world, I mean, it's like, hire, fire, hire, fire, hire, fire agencies like every 6 months to a year, because brands get in, they don't like it, they bail, and that's really hard for buyers to um, really understand the brand alignment, get in with the product long term, build out long term visions, all of those things. And so, in some sense, that level of accountability and the pressure that's on our buyers has really become intense. So,
Yeah. And because they're skeptical, more skeptical, that makes them more risk averse,
yes.
right? And that's why you suddenly have a bigger buying committee. You have more stakeholders, because not any individual wants to take the risk anymore. They need to share the risk, and therefore, problem for the sellers: more stakeholders, more conversations. Sometimes stakeholders you don't feel comfortable with. Suddenly, there's a financial buyer. It's all it always expanded this whole, and where it started is the skeptical piece. And I really like what you said about overwhelmed with options and underwhelmed with results. That's really cool. That's the second thing I'm going to nick today from you. Thank you.
Well, I'll tell you, in your podcast that you did, you talked about that risk of doing nothing.
Yeah.
And it is again, it's one of those things that consultative sellers really need to lean in on a little bit more, because sometimes I think that the fear of doing nothing is sometimes known but not discussed, and doesn't want to be approached. And so you, as a seller, you have to kind of start that conversation. You've got to and sometimes give them things that they haven't thought about, as well, within that risk averse. So I love that you mentioned that. And so there's two things that you taught me in your reading.
There you go. You and me are even now. That's great. That's great. Brian, you mentioned earlier the coaching aspect of that. Let's get this piece a little bit back onto the execution of sales strategy. You mentioned a little bit that coaching is really important in that execution part of things. You as a senior leader in your industry, what would be the one piece of advice, should I say, you'd offer to ensure that sales strategies are really used and not just stayed on paper, but actually drive results? What would be your advice to other leaders and peers?
If you don't believe in it, they're not going to believe in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that really comes across. And so, you can pound pavement on product and solution, and you've got all these talking points, and you've got customizable decks, and you feel like you handled objections. But I'll tell you, at the end of the day, humans buy from humans, and they know if you believe in what you're really selling, or if you don't. And if you don't really believe that you got the right solution, and that it's a proven concept, it's been qualified, it's been activated, it's we know that we can do this for you, and without a shadow of a doubt that this is what they need, that's going to solve that problem, you're going to have a tougher time selling it. And so that's my single advice on that.
My last question on every podcast, and I can't believe we're almost out of time already. The time really flew by with you. Fascinating insights. Last question on every podcast is always, what do you think? AI comes into the sales process. It's everywhere. We always talk about how important the human element still is, and so forth. what do you think going forward are the top 3 skills and behaviors that elite salespeople need to stay elite and stay, on the top of their game? The top 3 skills and behaviors that you think they need.
Yes. I'll rattle them off and then just double click on each one of them.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
business acumen, agility, and authentic drive. And so, with business acumen, I think that if you're talking to a C-level executive in our world, it would be a CMO. You need to speak the language of a CMO.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And so if you're talking to a media planner, a junior media planner at an advertising agency, you need to speak the language of someone who works within the media spectrum at an agency. So
Right.
that's kind of what I mean with business acumen,
Yep.
and tying your solutions always to that acquisition goal. Agility, I alluded to it a little bit earlier, but you just mentioned it with, like, for example, AI and what AI is having, not just on the sales demand side of things, but on the buyer side of things. If you're not sort of pivoting and embracing constantly, you're gonna have some problems. So, I think that when new tools roll out, new platforms roll out, new data rolls out, you should sponge it without resistance. Right, and then figure out how it can benefit you as you approach the market. And then, authentic drive for me is what I just mentioned, and that is, you need to see selling as a craft and as a career, and that you're always looking to sharpen your skills and intrinsically motivate others. I think that sales leaders especially need to understand that they're not just there. They're there to meet quotas, yes, and targets, but you're also really there to deliver client success. And as long as you're delivering client success, you've got that authenticity in your market approach that will open up doors for renewals and whatnot.
Yeah.
So
Right.
yeah.
A nice combination of list: business acumen, agility, and authentic drive. I love it. Thank you, Brian. You've been an absolute superstar. This is an excellent episode, and I encourage everybody to listen it and share it with others. I know our listeners very, very much appreciate your insights and your thought leadership. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Harry. Really enjoyed it.
My lovely people, 2 calls to action for you. Go to the b2bsalestrends.com site. Share this with anybody you think this would be of interest to, or go to the YouTube channel, B2B Sales Trends Podcast. Subscribe, like, share. That will be extremely helpful. Until the next episode, look after yourself, look after your loved ones, and look after your B2B customers. All the best.